In the fourth episode of this tutorial series, we'll be adding a lot of life to our portal by texturing our entire scene with stylized shaders. If you find yourself enjoying this tutorial, consider checking out my premium classes on Skillshare. I'm excited that I can offer everyone a completely free month of premium Skillshare membership by using the link in the description and comments below. I have 9 unique classes focused on many different aspects of Blender, like my Model a Mushroom Terrarium class. With that out of the way, let's proceed with the tutorial. We're going to start by going up to the shading workspace located here at the top. This is a pre-made workspace that has your interface purpose-built for texturing your 3D objects. Let's remove these 2 windows here on the left side as we won't really need them and they're just taking up space. So the easiest way to remove these is to just hover over the top left corner of this viewport here on the top. And you'll see my mouse turns into like a little bit of a plus sign. So once it turns into a plus sign, just click and then drag to the left, it'll turn to an arrow. And then when you let go, it'll kind of overwrite that viewport and just get rid of it. Let's do that same process here on the bottom. Hover over here, make my mouse turn into a little plus sign, click and drag until it's an arrow, and then let it go. And then lastly, we're going to switch our viewport on the top to the rendered viewport instead. So we're going to click this top right circle here, and that'll switch it to the rendered viewport. So we'll notice that this one's a little bit different than what we were working in. And before we were working in the shaded, which is this one here. So this is what you're used to seeing. And this is basically just our models with no actual lighting in it. Any lighting that you're seeing here is kind of just the viewport mimicking lighting so you can actually see what you're doing. However, if we switch it to the right side here, this rendered viewport, this is actually showing us the lighting that's currently in our scene. So our scene right now has some ambient lighting, which you can see just by this gray background here. There's just kind of this gray fill light everywhere. And then it also has this light here that was defaulted in our scene. This light started in our scene when we chose the general file type. If for some reason you've accidentally deleted this light, that's okay. We can just remake a new one. So if you don't have this light in your scene and you're not seeing the lighting that we're seeing currently in this video, you can hit Shift and A. And then instead of choosing mesh, we're going to go down here to light, and then you can choose point. This will generate a brand new light. We can see it's dropped it right in the middle here. And then we can move this off to the side. So to see your tools over here, currently they're hidden because you don't usually use your tools in this view because it's mostly meant for shading. But if you need to see them, you can hit T on your keyboard and that'll bring up your tool menu on the left side. So now we can just select our move tool and then move this light out so we're actually, it's not stuck in the center of your portal here. And then the last thing you'll need to do with this new light selected is go down here to the object data properties, which now looks like a little light bulb, and just switch this power from 10 to 1000, which is the default power for this light over here. And we can see now that we've actually got 2 lights in this scene, so it's making my scene really bright. In our case, we don't need 2 of them. This would only be useful if you've accidentally deleted yours. So in my case, I don't need this light, so I'm just going to delete it. I'm just going to leave the original light that I had in my scene. And then I would suggest you also move it a little bit forward so it's not lighting the back side of your portal. We want it to see the front side of the portal here. This will make texturing a little bit more clear when we're doing it. Okay, so with all of that out of the way, let's actually begin texturing these objects. We're going to start with the portal itself first. So we're just going to select the portal. And then down here, we're going to click the new button. And this will create a new material applied to this object. Right here where it says material 001, we're just going to click on that and we're going to call this portal. So we know what this material is actually applied to. Down here on this bottom viewport, this is actually where we're going to be editing the look of the material. So we can zoom in and out with our mouse wheel. We can also click in the mouse wheel to pan it around so we can slide it around and see more of this view. If this is the first time you're seeing the node system within Blender, let me give you a very brief rundown. Each of these squares we're seeing here are called nodes. Nodes pass their attributes from the left side to the right side. Each node has colored dots on it, like these, called sockets. You pass the properties of a left node to a right node by connecting their sockets together with wires, like this. To add more complex effects, you simply add the appropriate node and then connect it to the other nodes in the system using the sockets and the wires. The 2 nodes it makes by default for us are the material output, which is basically just concerned with what we're seeing in the viewport. And then this node here on the left side, this is kind of like a hub node. This has a whole bunch of different properties on it that we can adjust, and a lot of materials can be made just with this node itself. And this is called the principled BSDF node. So currently the principled BSDF node is passing its properties to the output node through this wire here. Now let's begin adjusting some of the properties on this portal. We're going to start by going down to the middle of this node here. And we're going to find the specular and the roughness slider. We're going to set both of these down to 0. I'll explain what these sliders mean in a later material, but for now we're just going to set them to 0. Now we're going to move further down this node by clicking in our middle mouse button and panning down, and we're going to find transmission. We're going to set our transmission all the way to 1 just by clicking and dragging and setting it all the way up to 1. And we can see here it's essentially made it into kind of like a glass material. This is usually used to make materials look like glass, however we're using it to prevent light from affecting our magic portal by allowing it to pass right through it. We want the glow we're about to add to this portal to be the only thing interacting with it. The last thing we need to change on this node here is we're going to switch the emission strength from 1 to 10 instead. Now we won't notice anything right away, but essentially this is just the strength of the glow that we're about to apply. So 10 is brighter than 1. So if we keep increasing this value, it'll just make the glow brighter and brighter. With those settings out of the way, let's add our first node. So we're going to hit Shift and A to bring up our add menu, just like we were before. And then here, we're going to search. So we can click the search button, and we can type in wave, so W-A-V-E, and we're going to choose wave texture. So once we click that, we'll see now that we have a node, so we can just click and place it anywhere we'd like, and we can move these nodes around after we're done, so you don't have to worry about where you place it. And now we're going to connect this to our system by connecting this factor, so this gray socket here. And we're going to click and drag that, and drag the wire to the emission slot here. And we can see right away, as soon as we've connected that, we now have a texture on our portal here, and it's glowing white light onto our scene. Now currently this wave texture doesn't look particularly portal-like. It does look cool, but it's not what we're looking for. So let's start adjusting some of these parameters here. So I'm going to zoom in down here on the wave texture. And we're going to start by switching this from bands to rings instead. Now we're going to change the direction from X to Z. And we can see now it's starting to look a little bit more like a portal. And we're going to change it from sine to triangle. This is basically just kind of like the type of rings that it's making. This just changes the overall shape of the ring. Now we can move further down this list, and we're going to change some of these settings as well. So the first thing we'll change is the scale. We're going to set this to 2. Now we can change our distortion and set this to 12.6. We'll change the detail to 2.4. So each of these settings here are making minor adjustments to the shape of these rings that we've applied. And then the next thing we're going to change is the detail scale. We're going to set that to 0.8. And then our detail roughness, we're going to set that to 0.6. And then hit enter. Most of these values here you would normally just find by trial and error and just kind of sliding them around and seeing what looks good. But since I've done this project before, obviously, and I'm teaching you how to do it, I know these values here are the exact values I want, so that's why I had you just type them in. Ordinarily, you wouldn't just know the exact values you need for these. You would have to kind of slide them around and see what looks best and then decide to go from there. So while this is starting to look a little bit more like a portal, we also notice that it's not actually centered. We'd actually want the center of the rings to start here in the middle and then to kind of go concentrically outward. So let's reposition this wave texture, this ringed wave texture that we've made to the center now. We're going to need 2 nodes in order to fix this. So we're going to start out by hitting Shift and A. And in the search bar here, we're going to click that. And then we can type in mapping. So just M-A-P-P. And we can choose mapping. We'll place that. And now before we do anything with this, we're going to make another one. We're going to hit Shift and A. Go to search. Click on that. And then type in texture space. And then C will be enough for it to show. So texture space C, and we're choosing texture coordinate. We'll choose that, and then place that node here. So now let's start linking these up. We're going to link from generated down here to the vector. And this basically just tells Blender how to place the texture onto the object. And now we're going to connect this vector socket here, down here, to the vector socket on the wave texture. So we'll notice after connecting these all together, nothing has really changed up here. That's because we haven't changed the settings on the mapping node yet. So the first thing we need to do is switch it from point to texture. So now basically all of the adjustments we're making here are based on the texture. And now if we select one of these values down here, such as the X or Y location, and just click and drag it, we can see that it's actually moving that texture along the portal. So if we type in 0.5 for the X location, and then 0.5 for the Y location, we've now successfully centered this concentric circle right in the center of our portal. So this is the actual look that we were going for originally. But we needed these two nodes in order to center that out in the middle. Now that we have our basic portal texture made, let's actually add some color to it and make it look a little bit more cartoony. So we're going to need a color ramp node to do that. So we can hit Shift and A, go to our search, and then type in color. And then the very top one we want is color ramp. So we'll choose that. And then we can just drag it directly on top of this wire here, so this line. And we'll see as we do that, it starts highlighting it. It turns white. So we'll just click and drag, or we'll drag it up on top of it and then place it by clicking. And we can see it automatically links it up for us. So it's linked the factor down to the factor, and then the color to the emission over here. We're going to be using this color ramp to adjust these black and white colors that are in the original black and white wave texture into more fiery orange colors. Let's zoom in down here on the color ramp so we can see it a little bit better. And now let's click on this little slider down here, this white slider, and we're going to move this inward. So basically these sliders just determine how much of that color is present within the texture. So we're going to select the far right one, this white, and then we're going to change the position. So we could just click and drag it and move it, but I know the exact position we need in this case is 0.75. So we can just type in 0.75 for the position, and it'll move it exactly where we need. Now let's change the color of this so it's not just white. We can do that by making sure we have this slider selected. And then down here, this color bar, we can just click on that color bar and it'll bring up a color wheel. Now normally if you were just picking colors for yourself and you weren't following along with a tutorial, you could just click on this little white dot here and drag it around and it'll change based on wherever you put that dot. So this is a really easy way to just kind of freeform choose your colors. You can also choose to make them darker or lighter by clicking this little dot on the right side and sliding it down to make them darker or up to make them brighter. For the sake of the tutorial, I'm going to give you the exact numbers that we'll be using for it. Feel free to deviate from them if you'd like to, and if you want to make your portal a little bit more unique, but if you want to just follow along exactly with me on the tutorial, these are the numbers I'll be using, and we're just going to be typing them in down here so we get the exact color. So for the hue, which determines the color, we're going to set 0.07 and then hit enter. So we're going with more of a yellow fiery color. And then we're just going to turn the saturation all the way up to 1 by clicking and dragging on it all the way up to 1, and we can leave the value also at 1. So now with this yellow slider selected, the furthest right, we're going to add a new one here in the middle. So we're going to do that just by clicking this little plus sign here. And that'll add a new slider here to the left. And we're going to change the position of this new slider. We're going to set that to 0.25 and then hit enter. So now with the position changed, we can click on this little color bar down here and we can switch this color as well. Let's make this one a little bit of a deeper orange. We'll go up to the hue and set that to 0.01 and hit enter. So it's going to make it a little bit more red. Let's make our value all the way up to 1, and we can leave our saturation also at 1. Okay, so now let's select the last slider here, which currently is black, and we're going to change the color of that. Now we're not going to move this one at all. We can leave it all the way to the left. So we can just select this bottom bar down here, and we're going to switch the color. So let's start by making the value. We're going to set that to 0.3. We can set the saturation all the way to 100% so we can actually see the color that we're about to put in here. And then for the hue, we can type in 0.012 and then hit enter. So we're giving it kind of like a dark sort of burnt orange color. The portal is looking a lot more colorful now, however it also has this kind of blurry look. In order to make the portal a lot sharper looking and more cartoony, we're going to be switching the type of gradient that it's using. Currently the default is set to linear. However, if we switch it to constant, so we click this little drop down and then choose constant, we'll see that rather than having blending between those colors, it just gives them exact colors, it gives them hard edges essentially. So if we zoom in here, there's no blending between these colors. We're just determining how much and how wide that color is on the portal. So if we go down here, and you don't have to follow along, but just for the sake of example, if I wanted more yellow, I would just make the portion of this bar down here more yellow, so I would see more yellow in the portal. So I'm going to set mine back to 0.75, but that's how we would adjust the dispersion of these colors. So currently the most prevalent color is this middle color, which is that kind of middle fiery orange. Then we have some yellow highlights, and then we have some darker areas, which are these here. Now we'll also notice on our portal that we're getting some jagged lines here in the middle. And that's because of the waviness of the outside of our portal. So if we wanted to diminish some of this kind of distortion that we're getting right in the center, we would need to also diminish the amount of waviness we're seeing on the edge. So if that's something you'd like to do, we can go to the modifier panel here. So with our portal selected, go to our modifier panel, and then we can just change the strength. So right now it's set to 0.5. If we set this to 0.25, so if we have that, the edges of our portal won't be quite as wavy, but we're also not getting quite as much distortion here in the middle. So I think for my portal, given the amount of distortion I was getting, I'm going to lower mine to 0.25, but yours might be different. So if you'd like to leave it at what it was at, you can do that. Or if you can lower it and make it look a little bit better, this is how you would do it. Okay, so now that our portal is done, let's apply a material to our portal bubbles. So we're just going to select the portal bubble, and we'll notice down here that that material has disappeared. And it's not gone, it didn't delete it or anything. It's just only showing the material for what you currently have selected. So in this case, we have the portal selected, it'll show the portal material. As soon as we select off of it and select the portal bubbles, it just now no longer shows anything. So let's add a new material to these portal bubbles by clicking the new button here. Let's rename this material portal bubbles so we know what it is. Now we can zoom out. And again, we're basically back to square one. We have a regular plain default gray material. So let's go through here and mimic some of the settings that we had on the portal itself on the portal bubble. So we're going to zoom in. We're going to lower the specular value down to 0. The roughness down to 0. Moving further down the list, we'll set the transmission all the way up to 1. We're going to make the emission strength 25 this time. So we want these to be a good bit brighter than the portal itself, and that's because they're a lot smaller. So the smaller they are, the brighter they need to be in order to compete with the brightness of this really large portal. So we're going to set the emission strength to 25 in order so that they visually feel about the same brightness. And then rather than adding a bunch of nodes and going through a wave setup like we did for the portal, we don't need to go through that complexity. We just want these to glow a solid color. So we just need to change the emission color itself. We don't need to add any more complexity to it. So we can just choose this color bar here for the emission color, set the value all the way to 1, the saturation all the way to 1, and then we can change the hue to 0.01 and then hit enter. And this is the same color that we chose here for the middle color. So we're just kind of picking that nice kind of medium value. Now it's looking a little bit brighter. The color itself looks a little bit closer to this yellow color here, and that's because of the emission strength. The brighter this is, the lighter that color is going to appear as well. And that's it. We're done with the portal material. They don't all have to be quite as complicated as the portal itself. Now let's move on to the stone material that we'll use for almost all of the remaining objects, aside from the magic runes on the stones. We'll handle that later. We'll start by selecting the stone base down here. Now we can hit new to make a new material. And we're going to call this stone and then hit enter. We'll start by adjusting the parameters on this principled BSDF node here. This is essentially, like I said, the hub node. So we'll go down here to the base color, and we're just going to choose a solid color. For this, we're actually going to choose kind of like a dark blue color for this stone. We're going with more of a cartoony kind of stylized look, so we're going to use a really dark blue for this. So for our hue, we're going to set that to 0.6. The saturation we can make all the way up to 1. And then we're going to make the value a lot lower. We're going to set this down to 0.05 and then hit enter. So you can see it's still blue here, but it's almost black. Now let's zoom in here on the stone portal base. And we're going to find a spot where we can see a bit of a reflection here. So in my case, on the left side here, I can see this kind of red glow I'm getting from this portal bubble. Yours may vary. Just find a spot where you can see a little bit of a reflection on here. That'll make this next explanation a little bit easier to understand. So I'm going to zoom in here for mine. So down here on the bottom, let's go down to the specular slider. So in this case, I'm actually going to explain what it's doing because we're actually using it for its intended purpose this time. So the specular slider essentially just tells the material how reflective it should be. So if we have it set all the way up to 1, it's as reflective as it can be. And if we have it set all the way down to 0, you can see it's not reflective at all. Most things in life are entirely without reflection. Even the least reflective thing you can think of still technically has a reflection. So you don't usually use 0 unless you're doing something really stylized, in this case like a magic portal. A magic portal shouldn't be shiny, so we completely removed all the reflection just so we didn't have to compete with it. In the case of the stone on the base though, we do want to have some reflection. We're actually going to make it relatively reflective by setting it to 0.7. So this is almost completely reflective, just a little bit off the top. The next parameter we're going to mess with is roughness. So roughness is sort of the counterpart to the reflection caused by the specular. So if we have our roughness set all the way down to 0, we're essentially getting glassy, almost mirror-like reflections. There's absolutely no blurriness to them. They're, basically you're seeing an exact duplicate of what's reflected on the object itself. If you set it all the way up to 1, it's completely blurred out. Now in real life, this would be the things that you're thinking of that are not reflective. So if you think of like asphalt on a road doesn't look reflective, but in reality, it's just because it's so rough that you can't see the reflections. So if you look at the reflection here of this light, it doesn't quite look like it's reflecting anything. It just looks like it's being illuminated, but it's because this reflection is so dispersed and so blurry, almost like sandpaper, that it kind of looks like it has no reflection. So for our stone, we're going to make the reflections relatively sharp, and we're going to set them down to 0.4 and then hit enter. So now we can see that we have a relatively shiny stone that also has pretty sharp reflections. This reflection still kind of looks like a circle, which is what it's reflecting. Now let's move on to the part of this texture that makes it look a bit more like an aged and cracked stone. We'll be adding a node called bump. Bump will take a black and white image that we input and convert it into height data. This will make our texture appear to have bumpiness even though we're not adding any actual geometry to the model. This is how video games would make a brick wall look bumpy and cast shadows on the mortar without actually modeling every single brick on the wall. So this is a really common effect that you'll see across many different applications. Most likely in video games you would see it, but you would also see it in more realistic renders or maybe even CGI for movies. So by inputting a black and white image into this bump node, we're telling it to view the white parts of the images as popping outward in space, and the black part of the images as pushing inward in space. So a crack on a stone would most likely be black on that texture, because cracks tend to go inward into the stone, not outward. So now let's begin zooming out and going to the bottom of this node. And we're going to place our new bump node down here. So we can hit Shift and A to bring up the add menu, click search, and then type in bump, and then hit enter. So we can place that here. And we're going to connect the normal socket to the normal socket over here as well. So now they're connected together. Now we'll notice right away nothing happens, and that's because we haven't put our black and white image into the bump node yet. Before we add our image though, let's lower the strength. Right now 1 is going to be really, really strong, and it's just going to make what we're doing with the image kind of look really ugly and hard to read. So we're going to lower this down to 0.175 to begin with, and then hit enter. Again, this isn't a value that you would just know offhand if you were familiar with 3D. This is just the value that after having done this project, I realized that the strength needed to be much lower, so I lowered it, and I'm just going to have you start at that point. Normally you would just plug everything in and then lower down your strength to visually match what you're looking for. Now we can hit Shift and A and go to the search menu, and we're going to type in Voronoi. So that's V-O-R. And once you type in that, you'll see at the very top, Voronoi texture. So we can choose this, and then we can place it here. Now let's connect the distance into the height on the bump map. And we can see after doing that, we do actually see some changes here on our stone. So let's zoom out. I'm actually going to go over here to the right side because there's a little bit better lighting over here. So we'll be able to see what it's doing a little bit more. So while this looks interesting, it's not quite the look we're going for. I actually want to see some kind of like actual cracks running through this. I want it to be relatively smooth in the areas where it's not cracked. And then where there are cracks, I want to see them go into the material. So let's start changing some of these parameters here. So the first thing we'll want to change is right now where it says F1, we're going to change the type of Voronoi that we're using. So these are all just different modes that all look different, and they're kind of just being generated by different algorithms. The one we want is distance to edge. So we're going to choose distance to edge. We can see here it has changed the look of it. It's a lot smaller, and it's a little bit more sharp. Let's change the scale down here. Right now it's set to 5. We're going to lower it to 2 instead. So after lowering it to 2, it looks pretty similar to what it did before. Before we go any further though, let's add our mapping and our texture coordinate nodes. So we can hit Shift and A, go to search, type in mapping, apply this, and then Shift and A again, search, type in texture, and then space C, and we'll see texture coordinate, and place that. Now we can connect the object socket on the texture coordinates to the vector on the mapping, and then vector to vector from the mapping to the Voronoi. And we can see here it's changed the layout of this texture a little bit more. Now down here at the bottom for the mapping node, we are going to adjust some of these scales here. And these scales are just numbers that I found that kind of stretch these crack patterns out into more of a stretched kind of horizontal cracking, which is what we're looking for the stone. This is again something that you probably wouldn't know just offhand. You wouldn't know to type these values in. It's just something that I played with, found that looked good, and now I'm going to have you start with these values in mind. So for our X, I'm going to type in -0.4. And then for the Y, you can type in 1.4 and then hit enter. So it's just basically stretch these cracks out a little bit so that they lay a little bit better on the stone itself. Now the most important step here is actually to add a color ramp node, which is going to make these look a lot more like cracks and less like general kind of lumpiness that we currently have on the stone. So let's go over here, and we're going to be placing this between the Voronoi and the bump. So we can hit Shift and A, go to search, and we can type in color, and then choose color ramp. Then we're just going to click here and place it between these two, and it'll automatically connect it for us. Now the main thing we really need to do here is to clamp the amount of white versus black. Currently we have too much black in our texture. So we need to lower this thing here, this slider, and the further we slide it to the left, you'll notice our cracks here on the stone begin to form. So as we move it further and further to the left, you can see here, now it's starting to look more like there's cracks in our stone. And that's because we're having a whole lot more white, which in this case is just going to be basically flat. And then we're limiting the amount of black so that it's kind of focused into these really sharp creases that look like cracks in our case. So for the position here, we're actually going to type in 0.015 and then hit enter. And then I'll make relatively thin cracks on the stone. And we can see those present here pretty much all over the stone. So we're just giving this kind of an aged, worn, kind of weather-beaten look to the stone. Now that the stone material is looking how we'd like it, let's apply this stone to the other objects in the scene. So let's start with the ground plane. We can just select the plane, And then rather than hitting new in this case, we don't want to make a new material. We want to just use the original stone material that we've already made. So we can just click this drop down here and it'll show us all the materials that we currently have in the scene. So we're just going to choose stone. So now we can see that this stone material has just been applied directly to the ground. And this is an exact copy of this stone material. So if we make any changes here, it's going to change it on both of them. So we'll have to remember that. Currently you couldn't just adjust the floor to be a different color versus the portal itself. In order to do that, you would need to branch this material. So if you wanted to actually make them two different color stones, you could do that by clicking this little number here. And this is just showing you how many users there are for this current material. So it's telling us 2. So there's 2 objects using this identical material. So if I click this, now in this case I won't be, but just for the sake of example, if you wanted to do this, you can click this number and it will branch this stone material. So it gives it a new name. And then this is completely independent of the stone on the portal itself. So you can see that now I've made this stone on the floor look completely different than the stone on the portal. Now, for the purposes of this tutorial, it's not the look I want, so I'm going to Control Z that. But if for your own personal render you wanted to do that, that's how you would. Now let's apply this same material to the cobblestones. So again, we'll just select the cobblestones, choose the drop down, and then choose stone. Now we can go up to the top of the portal. And we're going to apply the same stone material to each one of these floating stones. So I'm just going to start by selecting each one of these stones while holding Shift so I can go through and select each one. And then while holding Shift, I'm going to select the stone portal base last. Okay, so now I have all the portal stones selected, and then I selected the base last. I can now hit Control and L to bring up the link menu. And now I can choose Link Materials. So it's going to link the material of the last selected object to all of the new objects instead. And doing it this way was a lot faster than going to each stone individually and choosing the stone material for the dropdown. Functionally, it's the exact same as doing that, so going through each one and choosing it from the dropdown. It's just a lot faster to select each of them individually quickly and then just link them to the original material that I wanted it to match. Now let's work on the last material for this, and it's going to be the blue glow that we're applying to the magic runes. So let's start with the very top rune here, top center. With this top rune selected, I'm going to go over here to where it says slot 1. I'm going to click on this drop down here, and then I'm going to click the plus sign. So what this has done is added a new material slot to this object. Now that we're on slot 2, we can click the new button, and I'm going to rename this material. We'll call this Rune Glow, and then hit enter. And we can now begin adjusting the parameters on this Rune Glow material. The only thing we really need to change here is the emission color and the strength. So we're going to set the emission color here. We're going to set the value up to 1, the saturation up to 1, and then the hue to 0.5. So we have this nice kind of bright, sort of tealish glow. And then for our strength, we can set that to 10 and hit enter. Now I'm sure you've noticed right away that that didn't actually change anything here. And that's because we haven't told Blender where this material actually exists. Right now it's a material applied to this object, but it's not actually applied to any specific part of it. So it's basically just showing entirely stone at this point. So now to apply this material to just the rune itself, with the stone selected, we can hit Tab to enter our edit mode, then 3 to enter our face mode. And now we're going to hover over each part of this rune. So in this case, it's actually only 2 parts. That's one part here, that's one contiguous line, and then this separated line here. So let's hover over the separated line first, and we're just going to hit L to select it. Now you didn't want anything selected beforehand, so if you had anything selected, make sure you click off the model first to have nothing selected. Now hover over it and hit L on your keyboard to select linked. That's going to select every face that's currently linked to the one that you're hovering over. Now we can go down here to the next part of this rune, and we can just hit L again. Now there's no need to hit Shift in this case. It's just kind of a different selection operation. So you don't need to hit Shift to add to the selection. You can just hover over the next piece and hit L, and it'll select all of those linked faces. With all of these faces selected now, we can go over here to our material window. So this is the material properties. This is kind of a simplified view of what we're seeing down here. So if we scroll down this list, we'll see it's the exact same color and number here, and if I change it over here, it'll also change it here. However, this does have one other little button here that's a little bit easier to find on this menu, and that's specifically assign. So if I make sure I have my Rune Glow material selected here in the list, and then I choose assign, it's going to assign that material to just the faces that are currently selected. In this case, just the rune, because that's all we selected. With that done, we can hit Tab to exit our edit mode, and we can see that we now have a pretty cool looking blue glowing rune on this stone. But we'll notice it's not the same for all the other stones, and that's because we haven't applied this specific version of this material to each of the stones. So let's do that same link materials thing that we did before. And the reason we're doing it again is because we've added this new Rune Glow slot. If we go to one of these other stones and check out the slots, we don't actually have that Rune Glow material applied. So we're going to start by selecting just one of the other stones. In this case, I'm going to select the small one, hold Shift, go around, and select each one of the other stones except for the one that has the Rune Glow. We need to select that one last. Now with all of our stones selected except the last one, we can select it. And now we can hit Control L and choose Link Materials. Now again, you'll notice nothing happens, and that's because these don't have the rune material actually applied. And we're going to have to do that individually for each of these stones, and that's because they're all individual objects. So it's a little bit of a tedious process here, but it will allow us to apply individual rune glows to each rune and make them unique. So I'll quickly walk you through the process again one more time, and then we'll speed up the video, and then you'll just have to complete that same process on each of your stones as well. So I'm going to select this left one here, hit Tab, make sure I'm in face mode with 3. You should already be in face mode. It should remember it from the last time. And then hover over each part of your Rune Glow and hit L to select each piece. Remember, you don't need to use Shift for this. So I have just my rune selected. I can go over here to the right side on my Material Properties tab, choose Rune Glow Material, and then choose Assign. And we can see after hitting Assign, it's now applied just this Rune Glow material to just the faces that were selected. I can now hit Tab to exit that, and then move on to the next stone. So I'll see you in just a moment when I've finished applying this Rune Glow material to each of the individual runes. Okay, so we're done applying the Rune Glow material to each one of the portal stones. At this point, we're done texturing our scene. In the next episode, we'll be setting up our camera and lighting the scene using volumetrics. I'll see you there. Don't forget to click the link in the description and comments below for a free month of Skillshare. Watch my classes as well as thousands of others across a wide variety of topics. For the sake of transparency, I do receive a small amount of money if you decide to continue your subscription after that first free month. I truly appreciate the support. If you're enjoying the tutorial series so far, like the video, subscribe, and click the notification bell so you're notified when I release new content just like this.